A tabloid headline bled across the morning feed like a fresh bruise. Burke Corporation CEO spotted at hotel with woman. Scandal rocks high society. The photo that accompanied it was grainy, taken from a distance through a rain-splattered window. A man in a dark coat helped a woman into a waiting car. Their faces were blurred, but the silhouette of the man, broad shoulders, a habitual tilt to one side, was enough. For anyone who skimmed headlines and judged fast, the story wrote itself. Charles Burke saw it at 7:15 when his assistant tapped his shoulder and slid a single printed page across the mahogany in his office. He did not need to read the caption. The building hummed as it always did, the soft clatter of keyboards, the measured footfalls of security, the distant murmur of the trading floor. Outside, the city was waking in a drizzle, and inside, his life unraveled by someone else's camera lens. For all his successes, acquisitions, boardroom victories, the kind of calm ruthlessness that built empires, there were ineffable corners of his life he had long left unexamined. His marriage to Rose had become, over 8 years, a careful choreography rather than a conversation. They marked anniversaries because that was what married people did. He bought gifts because that was what husbands of CEOs did. He spoke words of affection in measured tones that fit into conference calls. They had a ritual, a quiet dinner at home, a small speech at midnight as the clock ticked to the date they'd agreed upon in the early days, and a simple token, each year a delicate necklace commissioned from the same small atelier of an old friend, Mr. Yi, with an engraving that only they knew. That ritual had started as a promise. It had become, in time, a prop. When he married Rose, Charles thought the most dangerous thing about his life would be competitors in suits. He had never suspected his own assumptions, when fed by society's appetite for scandal, could incinerate everything he thought steady. Rose watched the newsfeed from the couch of their townhouse, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. Her face held the calm of someone who had practiced composure so often it had become bone. There were small tremors beneath the surface, a tightness at the jaw, the way her fingers kept returning to a tiny scar on her knuckle that no one had seen but her. She had spent the last months trying to believe in a thing she could not see yet, a life stirring inside her. She was going to tell him that night. She had practiced the moment, the way she would reach across the table, how she'd fold her hands into his, how she'd wait for something more than the nod that usually punctuated his nights. Instead, the world gave them a photograph, a rumor, an accusation that needed no proof to be true in the court of public opinion. They met that evening in the formal dining room under the soft light of the chandelier. The table had one place for two.
The centerpiece was simple: white orchids. The necklace sat inside its velvet box on the plate beside Rose's napkin, wrapped in tissue paper like a secret. Charles entered late. That had always been his undoing. Time. He carried the air of the office home with him, the faint scent of disinfectant from morning briefings, the ghost of a speech half-rehearsed. He glanced at the box and then at the television screen, where, on mute, his own face flickered with the scandal. "Did you see?" his sister-in-law Emily texted him that afternoon, a single ominous bubble that had arrived while he was in a meeting. By the time he had noticed it, the rumor had metastasized into a whisper in every corner of his life. The board had called. The public relations team had drafted statements. His phone vibrated with the urgent cadence of numbers he had learned to respond to. Rose unwrapped the necklace without sound. The chain slipped across her fingers, cold, luminous. The pendant was a small, almost mate ornament, an oval stamped faintly with their date. He had not forgotten. He had sent it. He had, in one corner of his mind, made the gesture without thinking of its weight. "Did you sleep with someone at a hotel?" he asked without preamble. The question cracked the same way a bone does when it gives. The chandelier threw fractured light across his face. There was a corporate bluntness to his tone, a thing he used in meetings to close deals. It struck Rose as strange and foreign when it landed on her. No. Her answer was the same as it had been at the hospital, when a young nurse had offered condolences before they had even finished with the names. No. She watched him like one who tries to read a map by moonlight. There were 1,000 truths she did not have time to list, and fewer spaces in which to say them. "You were sane," he said. "Photos, a car, a room." The words were not a question anymore. He had already judged the evidence. The town square of his pride had been stripped bare. Outside, social feeds scrolled with commentary. A man in a tailored suit sat in a townhouse, and a world away he watched his life fracture in JPEGs. Family came like pressure. His mother, whose voice was honey and insistence, called in the first hour and demanded answers. "You promised me there would never be a stain," she said. The insistence in her tone was older than scandal. It was heirloomed dignity. His father's silence was heavier. He left a note at the house that read neatly, "There are consequences." Charles felt the house tilt. His hands were steady in the way men who navigate markets are steady. His skin began to prickle with the disorientation of being out of control. He had the ability to command quarterly earnings and redirect the tide of public sentiment with a well-placed denial. But personal humiliation had no corporate playbook. There was only the very human need to do something when everything felt undone.
Later that night, in the stillness of a bedroom that smelled faintly of lavender and the metal tang of the city, Rose told him she was pregnant. She moved her hand to her abdomen as if to anchor the news in flesh. He stared at her. For a beat that felt like a minute, the world narrowed to the circle of the pendant on her chest, the shape of her hands, the soft rise of her voice. A part of him, patient and drained, welcomed the news. A part of him, raw with the sting of the photo and the public shame that radiated from it, recoiled. "You're sure?" he asked, and the words were brutal because they were before congratulations. It was not malice, it was a fissure his own pride had made. She faltered, the answer folding in on itself. "I saw a doctor. There was a test." The test. He could hear the boardroom in his tone again, that need for documentation. Who? She did not finish. Her silence was not simple. It was full of the kind of history that comes from having been the quiet partner to someone who is always on stage. She had her reasons for not wanting to flood his calendar with details. She did not want witnesses in the private room they had been building and forgetting. But silence had become a place where misinterpretation slept. That night neither of them slept well. Rose watched him watch the phone like a distant comet. Charles replayed the photograph in his head until it was no longer a grainy image, but a proof in its own right. The pendant at Rose's throat glinted and took on monstrous symbolism, proof he had not seen before. Objects are dangerous like that. They become evidence when someone decides they must be. The first formal action was almost mechanical. Their lawyer arrived the next morning with a crisp folder. He spoke in terms of containment and press statements. He recommended a statement that would address rumors without admitting anything. He slid a draft across the desk, and in the corner the words "irreconcilable differences" waited, patient as a judge. Emily arrived that afternoon. She did not speak at first. She sat in the living room and looked at the photograph on the screen, enlarged now, and her eyes were stormy. Family pressure had a different voice when it came from neighbors and cousins, practical, immediate, garnished with a fear for social ruin. "What if this affects the board?" she asked. "What if it affects the children?" There were no children yet, but she asked anyway. The idea of lineage and standing brayed into every question. Some accusations gain credibility by repetition. Each mention, each forwarding of the photograph, each sideways glance from a neighbor acted like a compound, strengthening what needed proof. There were whispers at the company, quiet conversations at charity events, a slackening of handshakes. Charles watched how even the most loyal staff became cautious. Loyalty is porous when reputation is at stake. Rose moved through it with a dignity Charles had stopped noticing. She attended to small domestic things. She watered the orchids, she wrapped leftovers, she placed the necklace back into its box, because rituals need continuity, even in crisis. Her patience had the kind of anchor that is not a surrender, but a reserve of something deep. He signed the first papers like a man signing away a piece of himself he did not yet understand. The signatures were precise, ceremonial. His hand did not tremble. There was a legality to the motion that made it feel less like a personal wound and more like a transaction. He signed with the same economy of motion he applied to mergers and settlements. "Is this what you want?" Rose asked when they were alone later. The question as much about his life as it was about their future. He thought of what it meant to have people look at you and assume the worst. He thought of the board and the subtle ways investors distanced their fortunes from scandal. He thought of how quickly allies became concerned citizens with neat-sounding advice. "I want to protect what we've built," he said, which was true and incomplete. They divorced within weeks. The press release read like a sanitized obituary for a marriage. Mutual agreement, the statement said. It was a velvet glove on a knife. He told himself he was protecting them both, that a clean break was kinder than the slow erosion of public whispers. He told himself that business demanded clarity. It is easy to make decisions for other people when you are convinced you are saving them. Rose walked out of the civic office with an envelope and a flat expression. She had not been public, not really. She had not chosen this script. But there, under the cold fluorescent lights and the neutral carpet, she received the label others had assigned. In the years to come, she would replay the moment and find not villainy, but a certain clinical gentleness in their exchange, as if the world had grown bureaucratic about personal calamity. In another part of the city, Wenwan tied a silk ribbon around a small box and placed it on her table. She had heard the rumors about the Burkes and felt a strange echo of dread. Her story was different but familiar, small misunderstandings amplified under the light of pride. Wenwan and Fu Jingchen had their own necklace, their own little ritual. A designer had sent a piece to Wenwan as a freelance trial. When Fu Jingchen saw them together in a photograph, he did not understand. He assumed the worst. The parallel between the couples was not coincidence. It was a pattern. Small gestures misinterpreted, reputations collapsing like card houses, people moving too quickly to punish. Wenwan's subplot played out in brief chapters, a whispered phone call, a misdelivered text, a misread smile, and it served as an echo rather than a distraction.
Where Charles moved through the world as a man whose authority had hardened into armor, Wenwan navigated scandal with the small, private tremors of someone who valued truth over face. Their story would intersect only to underline a truth. Once a rumor takes the shape of a belief, it becomes harder to dislodge than any fact. Back in the Burke world, the pregnancy that should have been a private joy turned into a wedge. Someone had taken a photograph of a small paper slip, a pregnancy test, and it appeared on a private forum as an insinuation. No lab result was attached, no medical professional had spoken publicly, yet the forum thrummed with claims. The human desire to connect dots, even when the link is fragile, makes monsters of ordinary artifacts. The necklace, the hotel photo, the test, each on its own a simple object, together created the narrative. Rose had been unfaithful. The child might not be Charles's. Charles moved from alarm to certainty. He consulted with lawyers, with friends who managed reputations, and he found his default solution: separation. There was a grotesque efficiency in the way legal forms translated private grief into public files. He believed he was enacting justice. He said to himself that a quick divorce would close the book. Pride guided his hand as much as any prudence. Rose saw his decision as a crushing verdict. She had data sets and certainties inside herself she could not yet prove to him. She told him about the timelines, about the meetings she had attended, and the time she had spent alone. She insisted that the photograph was not proof because it had no context. It was a snapshot, not a narrative. She offered him witnesses, receipts, the name of the designer's assistant who had delivered a piece to her house. She spoke in the kind of specificity that courts like. He listened with the kind of attention that is not the same as hearing. He had become a man who measured love in leverage and security. To trust someone in the public storm required a kind of humility that did not come easily. The board asked for a statement. The board wanted stability. The media wanted sensation. Rose wanted to be believed. Charles wanted to salvage what he could without exposing himself to vulnerability. In that crevice, the divorce was signed. The week after, the headlines grew bolder. People lined up to take shots at the story from comfortable distances. The image of a man with a blurred face at a hotel was no longer just an image. It was the key to an entire narrative, and narratives, once opened, tend to attract other storytellers. Then, Rose disappeared. It was not dramatic at first. She left the house saying she would be back before dusk. She had errands, she said, or perhaps she wanted time away.
There were messages left on her phone that went unanswered. A canceled reservation at the small restaurant where she and Charles had had their first anniversary dinner. A note left on the table that said simply, "Keep the orchids. R." The note was the sort of thing people leave because they cannot face a conversation. It was minimal and brutal in its own way. Charles called her at first with the controlled alarm of a man who wanted to contain panic with logistics. He called friends. He asked aides to check cameras near the boutique she frequented. He posted a brief, tightly worded statement to his social channels, less to solicit help and more to disarm rumor. It did not work. He instructed security to search the neighborhood, to review entry logs, to canvass the usual haunts. He hired a private investigator with a past in law enforcement. The man's suit was cheap, but his eyes were efficient. He asked for details and lists, the way men trained in data asked for numbers rather than feelings. As the hours stretched, the public's appetite for the story turned from accusation to melodrama. The narrative mutated. A missing woman, a grieving husband, a tabloid infatuation with every breath they took. Reporters staked out the townhouse like predatory birds. Drones hovered over the street, their small shadows moving like punctuation. The search revealed nothing obvious.
Rose's bags were untouched in the closet. The pendant lay in its box where she had placed it. Her phone had pinged a few times, then gone dark. The investigator reported a lack of surveillance footage showing her leaving the city. There were no calls to distant relatives. The family attempted to control the narrative with a statement that straddled concern and a plea for privacy. It did not discourage the cameras. Charles sat in the living room as sunlight thinned into evening and felt the ballast of his life shift under him. He had moved through crises before with the confidence of command. He assembled teams. He rewired public perception. He negotiated behind closed curtains. But this was different. This time, arguments, signatures, and rationales had preceded a human absence. His sense of having done wrong, not maliciously, but unjustly, began to coalesce into something heavier than shame. It was guilt in physical form, a pressure behind the sternum, a taste of metal in his mouth. Memory, which had been efficient and selective during the crisis, began to betray him with small flashes. He remembered a minute in the pasta shop where Rose had laughed at a poor joke he told their first year together. He remembered the first winter they'd moved out of a cramped apartment and into a place they could call their own, how they'd marked the windows with duct tape to hold the heat. He cried then, he remembered, not because the memory was pleasant, but because it was a proof he had been able to love before success reshaped him into policy.
Those recollections were now guilt strikes. He had no armor for them. At a late hour, a nurse from the clinic Rose had visited called with a procedural update that tightened his stomach, a request for confirmation of an appointment, an unsigned form he was asked to verify. The nurse's voice was tentative, professional, and in it there was a shrug of small human error. "There was some confusion with the paperwork," she said. "We sent an intake form to an old email on file. Can you confirm her last visit?" The details should not have mattered, but now every bureaucratic seam in their lives suggested a place where an error could have been introduced, a misreading could have been magnified, a misfiled test could have become an accusation. Charles pressed his fist to his mouth to blunt a sound that had gradually become the world's soundtrack: regret. Word reached him the next morning that a woman from Rose's family, an aunt who kept an old ledger of names, had seen a man in a neighborhood cafe with a camera. She said it looked like the pattern of the hotel photograph, someone following. She described the pendant. The details were small and contradictory, and yet they fed the hunger of rumor. Charles started to sift through receipts with an attention he had not afforded his personal life in years. He examined credit card transactions for the dates in question, the hotel's reservation logs, the invoices from Mr. Yi's atelier. A mild inconsistency appeared, a delivery slip that bore Rose's name with a timestamp he did not remember. It was not in itself proof of anything. It was an irritant, a small stone in his shoe that grew into obsession. Emily suggested they call the press conference. "We need to control the message," she said, her voice thin with the urgency of someone who had never had to choose between love and standing. "We can't let this play out like a soap opera." He wanted answers more than he wanted control. He wanted to know if he had been a fool or a victim or both. When Wan's mirror story unfolded in between the headlines, she and Fujin Chen had an argument that mirrored the Burkes in miniature, an accusation about jewelry, a misunderstanding about a meeting. The echo made the Burke situation feel less like a sensational anomaly and more like the human condition, a repetition of the same error, an assumption made in public and acted upon in private. The city continued to hum with a million indifferent noises. Paper rustled, taxis hissed past curbs, and the world's petty rituals resumed. For Charles, life had narrowed to two things: the empty space where Rose should be, and the files on the table that memorialized a decision he had made too quickly. At the end of the second week, an overnight leak appeared, a blurry surveillance photo from an elevator lobby, circulating among forums that traded in scandal. It showed two people. The angle was unhelpful but suggestive. The woman carried a small box.
The man's profile looked familiar. The internet decided with its usual speed that it had the full story. Each new image, each whispered claim, provided another reason to harden or to flee. The investigator called in the early morning with a single note. "We found a discrepancy in the entry logs for the hotel on the night of the photo." He was cautious, saying the word discrepancy like a surgeon naming a sensitive condition. It was not a conclusion. It was an opening. Charles put his forehead against his palm and felt the cool of his office glass. For a moment he wanted to walk away from the empire and hide. For a moment he wanted to be the man who knew how to be wrong and then fix it. That moment was a small, fragile thing, and he clung to it. In the press, the story had ossified into a simple moral. A powerful man had been betrayed by his wife. In their living room, the truth was a tangle. Rose had not been given the benefit of a doubt.
He had done what he thought necessary to preserve his life's work. At night, after the lights had dimmed and the house was full of the dead leaves of ordinary routines, he would rehearse apologies and bargaining in the small private theater of his mind. He imagined downcast confessions that would get him back into the small sacred space where two people fit without spectacle. He pictured Rose's face, the soft lines around her mouth when she was about to cry, and he felt an urgency he had never felt in business meetings. For the first time, leverage felt virtueless. No amount of money could buy back the minutes he had allowed to become headlines. He hired a PR team to manage the fallout, and a separate team to find her. The teams did not speak to one another, which was symptomatic of how he managed crises, compartmentalized and deploy. He wanted the private truth and he wanted the public image to heal, but the two wishes were not the same. When he finally found a thread, a receptionist at a hotel who remembered taking a box for a woman who matched Rose's description and then mailing it on a whim, it felt like a miracle and a concession at once. The receptionist couldn't be sure. She couldn't identify Rose in a lineup. She couldn't prove it in any court but the one inside Charles's chest. Yet it was enough to point toward a different possibility. Perhaps, he thought, someone had staged the photograph, or perhaps Rose had been somewhere else entirely. Any nuance felt like hope. He took the flight to a neighboring city the investigator suggested. He moved through hotel lobbies with the discomfort of a man who had lost mastery over the simplest thing, the course of his own life. He asked questions in rooms that smelled of lemon cleaner and stale coffee. He showed the staff a photograph and held it as if it were a map to some hidden treasure. At the small cafe across from the hotel, an old woman with a steady hand asked if she could join him at the table.
Her name was Marta. She made a living doing other people's accounting for small inns, and she had the honest bluntness of people whose business was to keep honest ledgers. She spoke plainly about human error, about how sometimes people delivered packages to wrong rooms, how sometimes cameras caught the wrong angle, how sometimes the best story is not the actual one. "You were quick to sign," she said after a while, folding her fingers as in prayer. "Men like you are trained to act fast, but some things need a different speed." Charles did not argue. He had not yet realized how much his speed had become a weapon against his own heart. He had always preferred decisive motion to the slow attrition of doubt. The market rewarded men who acted. The investigator's call that night changed the tempo again. "There's someone who might have seen Rose the evening she left the townhouse," he said. "She met with a woman who works at Mr. Ye's atelier. They spoke about a custom piece." Mr. Ye. The name tugged at Charles's memory because of the necklace he had chosen and sent. It was a small human link. Mr. Ye's little shop, with its warm lamps and the green-stained thumbs of its assistant, had been a place they'd gone early in the marriage, when things had a softness Charles had forgotten existed. Charles felt a loosening in his chest, like the first inch of a returned breath. A meeting at the atelier might yield answers. If Rose had been there, then perhaps the photograph was a lie of context, a bad frame of a simple errand. When he arrived at the shop, Mr. Ye greeted him with measured hospitality. The shop smelled like copper and polish. The pendant in its case glinted under the lamp. Mr. Ye's hands, thick and reliable, spoke a language of craftsmanship Charles had little patience to learn. The atelier's assistant confirmed that Rose had come by to speak about a design, and had left a box to be shipped to a friend. The assistant's voice was hesitant, but its content was clear. Rose had been there that week. It was a small victory, and in public it meant little. In private, it was the beginning of an unpicking. By the time Charles left the shop, the rain had started again. He walked the city with his collar turned up and his fist inside his pocket. He thought less of lawsuits and more of what it meant to be wrong. He thought of Rose, of the small way she had always kept their shared rituals, and he wondered how many more things he had allowed to fossilize into formality. The city was louder than ever. Headlines, voices, and the mechanical rhythm of trains made a chorus around a man losing his wife to rumor and his own choices. Charles believed now that the simplest thing, a photograph taken at distance, could destroy a life quicker than any market collapse. He believed that the intangible world of reputation had more mass than the bones of a person. That night, he called his lawyer and told him to slow the dissolution.
Not to reverse all papers, he would not act with that theatricality, only to pause what could be paused without losing face. The lawyer was cautious. "Once the ink is dry in the public sphere," he said, "it can be difficult to unwind without additional damage." Charles understood. He also understood with a clarity that felt like a wound opening, that he had been impatient out of pride. Pride had done him the favor of making decisions for others as if he were saving them. Now he saw that the people he thought he protected felt ruined instead. In the quiet, late that night, he pressed his palms to his eyes and imagined the apology he would give. He rehearsed the words he would not let himself say out loud. "I was wrong. I was proud.
I was hasty. He had no practice in confession outside of the ledger. His public penances had been spreadsheets and strategic withdrawals. Now he needed to be small. The phone buzzed at 2 in the morning. It was the investigator again, the voice rough with exhaustion. "We found something else," he said. "Come to the clinic. Now." Charles grabbed his coat and drove through the city with the radio off. He navigated by memory and the thin cones of streetlights. The clinic sat like a pale island on a street of shuttered stores. At the reception, the night clerk was polite and surprised by the urgency in his manner. They showed him to an empty room with chairs, the smell of antiseptic sharp against the blue-lit sign outside. A nurse entered with a folder and closed the door with a discreet click. She sat across from him, hands folded. "There was a misfiled report," she said, calm as if reading weather. "A test was logged under the wrong name, and then a photograph of a test strip was shared online. We believe it might have been misattributed." Charles felt his throat tighten. Misfiled, misattributed. The words had the clean efficiency of hospital language, but the world outside the clinic did not speak hospital language. The internet had already turned the misfiled paper into a scandal. The retraction would not scale like the original accusation. "So it's possible she didn't," he began, but the nurse stopped him. "We can't say one way or the other without direct confirmation," she said. "There are privacy rules. We can only release information to the individual or their authorized representative. The photograph online does not constitute legal evidence." The legalities comforted and infuriated him both. They protected people, but in that protection they also made redemption slow. He wanted proof that Rose had been honest. He wanted to be exonerated publicly and privately. He wanted to go back and unsign the papers, to reach for the counteracting hand rather than the prosecutor's gavel. At home that night, the pendant lay like a small indictment in the velvet box. He opened it and felt the metal between his fingers, cold, ordinary. He placed it against his tongue as if taste could yield confession.
He sat in the dark and let the city hum on. He had spent years controlling other people's narratives. Now his own had rough edges. He thought, with a clarity only suffering brings, of all the times his default had been to protect his image. How many small acts of caution had hidden larger breaches of trust? He had been an architect of a life he had never learned to occupy fully. The city clock read 3 in the morning. He dialed Emily and asked her to come. When she arrived, she did not speak her usual counsel. She sat beside him, and together they tried to piece a life from rumors and receipts. "We should tell them to hold off," he said at last. "Wait on the formal statements. Let us find Rose first." She met his eyes, and for the first time there was no counsel in them, only the rawness of sibling fear. "If you slow down now," she said, "it will look like a cover-up." He had no answer then, only the knowledge that everything he did would be read as proof of either virtue or vice, depending on the audience. They were living in a net cast by other people. The threads were photographs, receipts, and the blunt instruments of legal forms. Charles had taught himself to act. He now felt how action without humility is cruelty dressed as protection. The first part of his search ended with a small, ambiguous victory. A worker at a shipping company confirmed that a package addressed to Rose had been couriered to an address near the hotel on the night the photographs were taken. The package contained a jewelry box. The label bore Rose's name. It was unremarkable, but it mattered. It suggested a simple errand, not an illicit rendezvous. The victory came with a counterweight. While they dug through logistics, the tabloid that had published the first photograph printed a second, more invasive story about the divorce, raising questions about custody not yet relevant, and adding speculation about possible paternity. The article quoted unnamed sources and used the word betrayal in the headline. The word landed like a blow. He sat in his car and watched the city keep moving. People walked dogs, nurses took late shifts, and the turmoil of his private life continued to be a public spectacle. He was both protagonist and casualty in a story he had not consented to fully live. At 3 in the morning, in a corridor that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee, he took a breath and made a decision that would change everything. He would stop acting from the place of fear for his image and start seeking the truth. He would put himself in the space of humility, open to evidence that might exonerate him or condemn him. It was a small moral awakening, sudden and late, and it would not undo the damage done by his earlier motions.
He left the clinic with a faint metallic taste of remorse in his mouth and the thin hope that searching for truth might bring Rose back, not as a prize to reclaim, but as a person to whom he owed an apology for the speed of his judgment. When he told the investigator to expand the search beyond the city lines, the man nodded with the tired compassion of someone who had seen too many stories like this. "We'll look for her," he said. We'll find out why she left." Charles thought about the conversation later and felt a pang. He had not yet asked himself why she might leave. He had focused on clearing his name rather than seeing her as an actor with reasons, agency, and fears. In the rush to protect an image, he had not tried to understand the person he had lost. He began to replay their past with a new ear. He listened for the things he had not heard. Rose's sighs after dinners where he had talked about quarterly earnings as if they were weather forecasts. Her small appreciation for details he had often dismissed. Her tendency to choose interior smallness over outward triumph. Each memory was a knife and a balm. It hurt, but it showed him what had been real. By the time dawn woke the city, he had a directory of people to call and a list of places to search. He had legal forms to pause and private investigations to expand. He had a craving for repentance that was not merely performative. The first act of contrition he made public was small. He instructed his team to release a short statement that asked for privacy and urged patience. It was a tempered plea, measured because he feared the excesses of the stage. He did not admit fault. He could not yet. He merely asked for time to search and to understand. For the first time in a long while, the man who had been decisive in business found himself waiting for a call, a sighting, a small sign, waiting for the person who had left him to return or to explain. Waiting became the new shape of his life, and with waiting came the slow, exact ache of regret. The search would take him to places he had not expected: a tiny atelier scented with metal and polish, a hotel with a worn lobby, a clinic with misfiled paperwork, and eventually to a corridor where a confession would be necessary. But none of that had reached the fullness of revelation yet. The city spun on with its indifferent rhythms, and Charles Burke, who had once controlled markets, sat in a townhouse stripped by rumor and felt his hands tremble as he realized that the most expensive thing he owned was trust, and that trust could be dissolved in a morning by a photograph and a hastily signed page. Charles kept moving because he could not stand being still. Movement was his refuge. Flights, late-night drives, the sterile rhythm of asking questions until someone answered. The investigator expanded the search into the suburbs, into the little towns where people still remembered faces and receipts.
They knocked on doors, checked CCTV that hadn't been reviewed, and listened to shopkeepers gossip like miners panning for a glint. At a diner on the outskirts of the city, a waitress with tired eyes pointed them toward a laundromat owner who remembered seeing a woman matching Rose's jacket buy detergent and phone carts. At a bus stop, a teenager said he had given change to a woman who used an older coin to call a number from a list. Each fragment felt both trivial and monumental. They were tiny clues, each one a possible stitch back into a life ripped open. Charles learned to listen in a different way. He stopped framing every question as a line item and started asking as if the answers might mend something. He listened for tone and hesitation. He cataloged pauses as if they were physical objects. It was awkward. People who had been used to following his orders waited for him to reclaim that composure. Instead, they found a man trying to be small. One afternoon, an unglamorous lead produced the kind of evidence that changed everything. A parking lot attendant remembered a woman collecting a package from a courier and being followed by a man carrying a camera. He was sketchy on dates, but he remembered the man because the camera had a strap with a noticeable tear. The assistant, an observant kid who sold coffee on the side, happened to work outside the small atelier where Mr. Yi made jewelry. He said the cameraman had asked directions to the hotel that later produced the photograph. A pattern began to form. The investigator traced the camera strap back to a rental account that had been used by a freelance tabloid photographer, one known for quick pictures and quick money. He also found references, buried in terse emails, to a woman named Sherry who had requested photographs of celebrity spouses in compromising positions for a gossip site. Sherry's name circled in Charles's mind with a slow, nauseous clarity. She appeared in passing in company memos and in a social calendar, the sort of person who attended the same charity luncheons and swapped small slights for the sake of belonging. Charles could not accuse without proof. He could only hold the list of names, the chain of late-night emails, and the little ledger entries that read like hints. But the ledger led somewhere. A small transfer from an anonymous account to a freelance photographer the day before the hotel photo was taken. It was not a smoking gun, but it was a burn mark. He confronted Sherry in a way he never had confronted anyone before. Not from the top down, but kneeling at the bottom of his own ignorance. He found her at an exhibit where she wore a silver collar and laughed like she had not a care. She pretended not to recognize him for a beat, and then let her guard fall as if the moment were expected. "You sent this picture," he said without preliminaries. His voice lacked his old armor.
The crowd ebbed and flowed around them,
and for the first time he felt the absurdity of asking forgiveness in a place full of strangers. Sherry's smile thinned. "I hired a photographer," she admitted. "They said it would be a scoop." Her hands twisted a napkin. She did not look like someone who had intended catastrophe. She looked like someone who had been careful about her own reputation and careless about another's. "You staged it?" Charles asked. The word tasted like metal. "I made a call," she said. "I asked the photographer to follow. I didn't tell him about names. I just wanted a picture of something that would get attention." She paused, eyes flicking to the crowd as if searching for a shade of sympathy. "I didn't think it would—" She stopped. The ellipsis was a small confession. It was not an absolute admission of a plotted conspiracy, but it was close enough to hollow out Charles's certainty that he had been betrayed. The photograph might have been crafted rather than found. If so, context that could have cleared Rose's name had been intentionally erased. "What for?" he asked, and the question was not just about motive. It was about what lengths people would go to when they wanted a story more than they wanted a truth. Sherry closed her eyes for a second, as if recalling a script. "There's always a reason," she said. "A chance to move ahead, a chance to be on the front page." Her hands were steady when she met his eyes. "I thought maybe the board would shift. Maybe I would have a better foot in. I didn't think about the people in the picture." Guilt arrived in Charles not as a blind revelation, but like a tide pulling at his feet. It left him breathless in a way his business risks never had. He could have used his power to crush Sherry and the photographer, to force legal judgments and celebrity confessions. Instead, he found himself wanting only to know where Rose had gone, and whether there was a way to put back what had been taken. The investigator found more: receipts, a remittance to the photographer, an email exchange that suggested Sherry had paid for images from a photographer who had admitted to staging shots. The photographer, under pressure, named a drop-off location where he had been given a promise of cash and told to make it authentic. His memory was dim on specific names, but clear on the sequence: follow, photograph, sell. These discoveries changed the internal contour of a case. They did not, however, put Rose back at the dining table or erase the signatures on the divorce. They only suggested that the truth had been clouded by ambition and opportunism. In a world that preferred narrative over nuance, the nucleus of error had been carefully manufactured. Rose's disappearance, Charles discovered, was not the product of an attempt to vanish into thin air, but a decision born of survival.
She had left because being present on their doorstep felt like stepping into an arena where the first blows were always assumed. She had stayed with her aunt, who lived beyond the reach of the tabloids, until she could consider the options in private. When Charles learned where she was, he did not call the press. He did not summon a camera crew. He sat in his car outside of a modest terraced house until he could hold himself together, because he knew, finally, that arriving in force would be a reenactment of the same impulse that had driven him to sign papers too soon. Rose opened the door wearing a coat that had once been his. There was no fanfare in her face, no dramatic tears, no righteous scorn, just an exhausted stillness that read like a verdict he had to stand under. "Why did you leave?" he asked, and the words were thinner than he had rehearsed in the long nights. She let the door shut behind her without answering. The house smelled faintly of boiled tea and lavender. On the table an old ledger lay open, and a framed photo of the two of them at a Christmas market looked like an artifact from someone else's life. Rose poured tea and handed him a cup. The ritual felt painfully private. "I left because staying felt like being on trial," she said finally. "I thought if I wasn't in the public square, I might think straight." Her hands steadied as she spoke. "And because I couldn't stay in a place where my husband's first move was to believe a photograph rather than my voice." Charles felt the sting of the words not as accusation but as truth. He had been trained to see numbers, to look at graphs, to anticipate trends. He had never been taught to weigh silence against affection. "I looked for you," he said. "I should have—" "You signed the papers," she interrupted. The fact was a flat thing on her tongue. She did not rise to shout. Her voice remained measured. "You believed proof, not people. You let other people decide the story." He had no defense that felt honest. The legal language that had sounded so protective in the office lost its luster at the kitchen table. It was language that belonged to lawyers and ledgers, not to the slow work of mending. "You didn't give me time," he said. "I am sorry. The sentence stalled because apology in the voice of someone who runs corporations has an odd syntax. He found himself saying things he had never had to say. "I was frightened of losing everything, and I made you lose something precious." Rose watched him as if cataloging his face, as if making a ledger of his remorse. "Words are cheap," she said. "So are signatures when made out of panic."
She told him, gently, that while she had been hiding, she had done two things. She had sought the records at the clinic, and she had spoken to Mr. Yi's assistant in greater depth. The clinic had confirmed the misfiled paperwork. Someone had logged the test under a similar name, and the image that had been posted online could have been misattributed.
Yi's assistant had given her a receipt showing that a small package had been shipped, with a note indicating it was for a charity auction in a nearby town. It held no more scandal than a misplaced errand. Rose's narrative was careful. She did not demand confession as though triumph were the point. Her aim was clarity. She had collected the bureaucrat breadcrumbs herself because she needed someone to understand why she had felt pushed into leaving. In her telling, there was no desire for dramatic vindication. There was only a desire to be seen. Charles listened as if each detail were a stitch in fabric that could restore the seam. For the first time since the photograph, he felt the edges of his actions, the signatures, the statements, pierce him. He also heard something else, a cautionary echo of a life he had let become transactional. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, not wanting to presume. She thought for a long time. "I want a life where our first response to each other is not a lawyer," she said. "I want someone who asks questions of me, not of headlines. I want a partner who can be honest about his fear." He could have offered everything he had to buy time, control the cameras, litigate, pay hush money. Yet none of that was what she named. She wanted humility. She wanted a man whose next moves came from regret and not from reputation management. He promised things he had not managed to keep in the past, because saying them felt like the only currency left between them. To step back from public performance, to slow the legal process, and to seek the truth with patience rather than spectacle. He offered to resign some public duties if needed, to let the board know that he would not let image protect him at the cost of trust. He offered to undergo whatever steps she required to feel safe. Rose did not answer with immediate forgiveness. She said she needed time, and that any return would be conditional on transparency and a willingness to make concrete changes. She named specifics: no more unilateral statements to the press, joint decisions on any public matters relating to the children they had not yet had, and a period of counseling where both would speak in ways that could be witnessed by a neutral third party. The conditions were both practical and an insistence that the past would not be swept away with a tidy press release. Charles agreed without hesitation, because the terms were small compared to the cost of losing her. He asked if in time she could allow him back into her life not as an emperor returning to court, but as a person seeking to be forgiven. She nodded slowly. But reconciliation on paper is not the same as healing in the marrow. There were other actors in their story, family members, shareholders, a public that had long ago formed opinions, and those threads would not be undone as easily as a signature could be reversed. Charles understood that there would be legal consequences and reputational echoes.
He offered instead earnest actions, a public retraction about the photograph's context where he would admit to a hasty judgment and request privacy while the truth emerged. He promised an internal company inquiry into the culture that encouraged a rush to judgment. Rose insisted on no spectacle around the retraction. She wanted words that did not seek absolution for him, but asked the public for patience while the facts were clarified. The next days were a mixture of small procedural victories and tender ruptures. The investigator dug further into the photographer's payments and found names of intermediaries who had facilitated the staged shot. Under pressure, one of them, less invested in the tabloid's glory than in quick compensation, provided a statement that matched the outlines of the story Rose and Charles had been stitching together. The photo had been manufactured, the context falsified. The clinic, constrained by privacy laws, could not publicly release certain details, but their internal records corroborated what Rose had suspected: misfiled paperwork. The photograph of a test posted online might not have belonged to her at all. That alone did not erase the suffering of being doubted by the man she loved. When the tabloid ran a follow-up, it was less theatrical than their initial hit. They hedged, used vague language, and quoted anonymous sources about ongoing inquiries. When a legal representative for the Burkes contacted the site with the documentary leads the investigator had uncovered, the outlet replaced the explosive headline with a muted correction, an editor's note that stated their original report had relied on third-party material that was now being contested. It was not full vindication. The internet does not easily retract wounds. But the small, steady course of facts allowed the narrative to lean back toward nuance. In private, Charles began to understand how quickly he had weaponized expediency, his signature, his statement, as a defense for what he feared most: humiliation. In his office, he took down the dried, careful notes that until then had governed his life and replaced them with a binder of what he would do differently: attendances at counseling, limits on unilateral press statements, and a pledge to listen first. When Wan and Fujinseng's subplot found its own small closure, Fu confronted a web of assumptions and, after reading the delivery receipts when Wan showed him and speaking to a designer's assistant who confirmed a misdelivered prototype, he realized his suspicion had been premature. He apologized in a note that was hummed with shy tenderness. When Wan's acceptance was cautious but not unavailable, they chose to rebuild in small gestures, quiet dinners not orchestrated for photos, and agreement to speak openly before surrendering to jealousy. Their reconciliation was not a grand event, but an incremental repair that served as a quiet echo of the larger lesson.
Back at the townhouse, the long process of public recovery began. Charles released a handwritten statement, something he had never done before, where he acknowledged his haste and asked for privacy as the truth was sorted. He did not use the occasion to absolve himself fully. He owned his failure and the fact that his first impulse had been pragmatic rather than personal. The statement had the awkwardness of someone unpracticed in humility. It read as a man attempting a new grammar. The press reacted with both skepticism and relief. The story no longer sold as easily. Investors who had been skittish watched as the narrative shifted. The board held closed sessions where Charles listened and did not dominate. At a meeting, he announced his intention to step down from one public-facing committee to focus on private reparations. It was not a theatrical resignation. It was an attempt at concrete restitution. People noticed the difference in his gait. He moved in public without the habitual armor. He accepted questions with pauses rather than instant rebuttals. He made calls to Rose's aunt to express gratitude for shelter, and to the investigator to express the small, private thanks that felt like penance. The confrontation that would change everything happened not in a courtroom or in front of cameras, but in a hospital corridor that smelled of bleach and the faint sweetness of antiseptic hand lotion. It was not the clinic where the misfiled tests had been recorded, but a hospital near the town where Rose's aunt lived, a place Rose had visited to confirm all that had been collected of her. Charles arrived in a coat too thin for the wind, and the corridor lights hummed with indifference. He found her by accident first, a glimpse of hair in a pile of people, a sleeve with a worn cuff, a hand that smoothed a stray strand from her face. He moved toward her as someone who crosses ice toward a known shape. Every step felt both inevitable and dangerous. She turned. There was a moment suspended between them, a hesitance that held the memory of everything they had lost and what they might regain. He wanted to speak and not to speak. Words had been used as weapons between them. He wanted now to use them as a tool. "Rose," he said softly, the sound of her name newly intimate. It had always felt public, an affiliation, an emblem. Now it carried only the history of nights and small habitual things. She watched him for a long breath, and then she sat down on the green plastic bench as if the choice not to stand was in itself a thing of dignity. "You look tired," she observed, not unkindly. He laughed, a brittle sound. "I am tired of being right and wrong in the press." They spoke then in the slow, measured grammar that had been absent from their marriage for too long.
He confessed, nakedly, about signing papers in haste, about thinking he had to act to protect more than himself. He named the board, the shareholders, the whispering neighbors, the way his mother's voice could turn fear into mandate. She listened, sometimes with a small smile that betrayed nothing, and sometimes with an expression so sharp it left him raw. When he reached for her hand, she did not pull away. "I was hurt," she said simply, "and I left because it felt like the only way to keep some control when everything else had been taken." There was no drama in her voice. There was only the heavy geometry of someone who had become practiced at carrying quiet things. "I am not asking you to forgive me now," he said. "I know I don't deserve it. I only came because I need you to know I'm sorry in a way that isn't filtered through lawyers or PR." She looked at him as if weighing the truth of the apology against the thousand small ways it had failed. "Do you understand why I left rather than explain?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "I do now." He knelt then, not theatrically, but truly, and it was the kind of smallness that had nothing to do with public gesture. He took both her hands as if the chance to hold them was rarer than a corporate victory. "Please," he said, voice pulling, "however you choose to answer, if you ever choose to, know I will accept whatever consequence you said. I will step back from the things that make me hide behind a title. I will listen. I will make the slow choices." The words were not clever. They were raw. He did not demand absolution. He only asked for a path to show contrition. Tears came to Rose's eyes, unexpected and private. She did not wipe them away immediately. When she spoke, the words were careful, tempered. She had been braced for humiliation, for a public fight. Instead, here was a man deconstructed, asking without bargaining. "Forgiveness is not a single thing you can give and call it done," she said. "It's a geography. "You can start moving through it, but you must walk it honestly." He nodded, and in that nod there was relief and a kind of fear. He knew the geography would be difficult. He also knew that the alternative, living under the weight of what he had done, would be worse. They did not immediately reconstruct the life they once had. There were small appointments, counseling, videos to watch with a therapist present, public statements written with both their signatures where they could. There was no grand reconciliation dinner. Instead, there were small gestures, a shared visit to the jeweler to confirm dates, Rose sitting in on a board meeting where she listened rather than being summoned, Charles canceling the public charity photo op to spend an afternoon with her aunt learning to make tea. The public arc was slower. The board accepted Charles's decision to relinquish a committee seat. Investors adjusted with the caution of their trade.
The tabloid that had first broken the story issued an editor's note under legal pressure. It did not make front-page remorse, but the tone of the coverage shifted from accusation to inquiry. In private, the couple worked to repair the most delicate part left by the divorce papers, trust. They took to meeting with a counselor who specialized in high-profile relationships. The counselor insisted on one thing that Charles had never had to consider: to build rituals that were small, not symbolic, and that required no audience. They learned the practice of naming their feelings without translating them into actions for external consumption. The work was not linear. There were nights when Charles wrestled with self-recrimination so sharp it left him sleepless. There were times Rose returned to the old habit of checking receipts, as if parsing numbers could ward off deceit. There were also moments of clarity, long drives where they spoke about the first time they had kissed in a rainstorm, the awkwardness of early financial scarcity, the way a small, misguided kindness had once become a marriage. Sherry faded into the background. Her notoriety brought her a tide of both critics and admirers in the tabloids. She gave a short statement in which she claimed she had been naive and that she regretted the wider consequences. There was no formal legal reckoning because the facts were not so neatly malicious as to support long litigation. What remained was the moral accounting that Sherry had to live with. Charles did not seek vengeance. He wanted repair, not retribution. He did, however, secure an agreement that the photographer would cooperate in a full account of the staging for the sake of truth, a choice that felt more like unearthing than punishment. Over the months, the speed of the public story lessened. People moved on to other scandals. Private life, which had been arrested by media frenzy, slowly resumed its rhythms. Charles returned to the business in a different posture, less eager to control public perception, more willing to be vulnerable about the mistakes he'd made and the slow, necessary steps he was taking. Rose became pregnant again, this time in a quieter way. The news was not an announcement, but a small confession over tea. It was a private miracle of sorts, buffered by precautions and a new protocol they had agreed upon to keep the matter between them and medical confidentiality. They allowed themselves to dream in smaller increments, an afternoon together here, a doctor's appointment shared there. The world might have once turned their private moments into spectacles. Now both of them purposefully kept some corners dark. The plea scene that the newspapers would later call the raw moment was not theatrical. It happened in the half-light of a late evening in a rooftop garden that smelled faintly of old leaves and city exhaust. Charles had asked to meet in a place that had no cameras and no easy access. The garden was a small secret the two of them had once shared. He begged then, quietly, with the small intensity of someone who finally understood his error. He did not perform his remorse. Instead, he offered a ledger of actions, counseling sessions he would attend, his vow to relinquish certain public duties for a season, and an offer to make formal amends in a way Rose found meaningful, apologies to people directly affected, steps to protect privacy for others who might be dragged into scandal, and an ongoing agreement that she would be part of any public decisions affecting both their lives. Rose listened. Her answer was not one of instant absolution, but of conditional willingness. She placed a palm on his cheek and said, "I am not the thing that happened to me. I am the person who has to decide how to live after it." Her forgiveness was measured, a decision to move forward together as two people aware of what had been broken and committed to not replicating that break through haste. Years later, when people recounted the episode to themselves as cautionary lore about fame and assumption, both Charles and Rose would quietly correct the moral. It was not fame alone that had ruined the early months, but the human reflex to protect image rather than relationship. They both learned that the currency of public reputation cannot replace the tender, messy work of trust. There were practical consequences.
Charles's reputation had a dent that mattered in boardrooms. He handed over a public seat and devoted more time to internal company culture, commissioning new policies about the company's response to personal scandals, and mandating slower processes for public statements. He also funded privacy initiatives for people affected by tabloid culture, an attempt to wrest some good from personal harm. Rose, who had always valued a quieter life, gained a kind of freedom she had not expected, the right to define her public presence on her own terms. She used the experience to start a small nonprofit that provided legal counsel and emotional support to people whose private lives had been invaded by tabloids, an effort that felt to her like translation, from harm into helpfulness. Wen Wan and Fu, having navigated their own smaller storm, offered an example to friends of what repair could look like in practice. They showed that listening and admitting error, even in small relationships, created a scaffolding for larger repairs. The most lasting scene was not a headline, but a domestic one. A late winter evening months after the scandal had quieted, the couple sat at the kitchen table, a modest dinner between them, the pendant from their early marriage glinting like a small, worn artifact on the counter. It was not a symbol of conquest or scandal now, but a witness to a life that had become more honest in its breaks. Charles sipped his tea and then set the cup down with a slow breath.
"I lost you because I accused you of being what I feared," he said, and there was no spin in the words, only a man accounting to the person he had wronged. Rose reached across the table and touched his hand, not with a flourish, but with the steady intimacy of something tempered by pain. "We lost time," she answered, "but time can be redeemed, not erased. That's the difference." He had begged for forgiveness in a corridor and on a rooftop and in 1,000 sleepless hours, but what he had not expected was that forgiveness would not be a single word or a single contact. It would be a sustained commitment, an earnest geography that both would have to traverse. He would still carry the memory of the signatures he had placed in haste and of the way publics can make truth a commodity, but he also learned the grammar of apology and the small sentences of rebuilding. In the end, the world outside moved on. Shareholders turned to new concerns, tabloids found new jokes, and the city kept its indifferent tempo. What changed inside the townhouse was slower and harder to narrate. A man who had been wrong, and a woman who had been patient enough to stay, if she chose to. Two people learning to speak to each other before speaking to the world. The lesson they lived with, the one that would linger in both their conversations and their quiet hours, was simple and brutal. Haste is a dangerous advisor, and pride makes quick judgments that cost more than the momentary comfort they promise. Charles had lost his wife to rumor and to his own fear. He had begged for forgiveness and earned, over time, a measured and conditional return. The cost was exact and ongoing. A career recalibrated, privacy repaired in fragments, and a marriage that now required daily, deliberate tending. When Rose later walked into a room where old friends paused before they spoke, she understood the power of not rushing to explain herself. When Charles afterwards stood before his board and spoke of humility rather than strategy, he found himself lighter in a way he had never imagined, less a man who commanded and more a man who could be trusted to listen. They were not restored to the life they had once taken for granted. They had built a different one, slower, more deliberate, and attentive to the tiny acts that make trust. In the years to come, when a younger colleague asked Charles what had happened that left him changed, he would tell the story not as a cautionary headline, but as an account of something deeper, how a photograph, a misfiled paper, and a signature made in haste had nearly destroyed the thing he valued most, and how asking for forgiveness, humbly and without the expectation of repair, became the first and hardest step towards being worthy of it. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe to follow more true-to-life relationship stories and character-driven dramas.